Yeah, so I usually like to start with a disclaimer that none of this is legal advice. This is all just going to be for entertainment purposes only. But today we want to talk a little bit about, recap on some of the things we talked about last time, and then also go into, go into some updates from what happened with the complaint with Todd, what happened with Catherine, what happened with, just some of these overall strategies that we've been picking up here overall in the last, couple of months. Some of the things that we've talked about so far were about the revocation of election. You remember Marjorie Taylor Greene, MTG, she'd been talking about people should no longer be filing their taxes. And what would the procedure be? What's the right maneuver to use to stop filing taxes? Without being legal advice, you talk to a tax accountant and all this before you do these things. But what's the right maneuver? What does the tax code say about that? And nobody's talking about that sort of thing. So, but it's right there in the IRS code. It's right there in the CFRs on what to say and what to do if you really look closely enough. So it's funny. At the end of the day, so I'll kind of go back into the beginning here. When I first started this stuff, I was like, I'll just do it, and there's got to be a remedy, and I'll just do it my way. I won't bother reading any instructions or rules. I was always the kid when, and you guys remember the kid that, probably as a kid, you get a new present or a new game or a new board game, and actually a new little jigsaw puzzle, and it would come with very simple instructions. I would grab that, rip it up, throw it away immediately. That would be immediately gone or lost. Then I would just do it, and I would not read any instructions ever. I would never follow any instructions. So that's how I started with the courts and all this legal stuff. As I was like, I'm not going to read any instructions. I'm not going to do any of that. I'll just go ahead and just do it and learn. And then the judge would punch me in the face, I would say, oh man, that really hurt. But then I would do it again and again and again and again and again and again. And I remember the very first year, I was so dumb and so reckless that I went in there 35 times into the court, ex parte, which is against it's against protocol. You're not allowed to do that, but I just kept doing it. I was polite and nice about it. I wasn't rude. I mean, I wasn't a jerk. I mean, I think that's probably why I didn't get in big trouble. But I mean, if you go in ex parte 35 times into a court in 1 year, you're probably going to get contempt. But fortunately, thank God I didn't. And by doing it that many times, eventually I figured out how to win, and how to make it work, and what the rules were. And that's like the hardest way to learn, but it's also the fastest way to learn, because when you have no tutelage and you have no schooling, and you're just learning from going into the fight, it's going to teach you really fast, because you're going to keep getting hit in the face so many times. And then as soon as if you keep getting back, if I kept getting back up, every time I got back up, I was like, oh my gosh, why I lost every time. And then all of a sudden it worked, because I followed these rules, and I found there was something called rules of court. There was something called local rules. Wow, I didn't even know they existed. But there's evidence code, and then there's civil code of procedure, and then there's civil code, and then there's even federal rules, and then there's also federal rules of civil procedure and evidence code in the federal court, and all these govern back from this thing called the Constitution, which I'd heard of, but they never taught me anything about it in school. And I don't know, anyone who grew up in America, probably post 1980. I'm not sure. I remember there's a guy called Paul Preston. He's a former school administrator up in Yuba. He's up in Sutter County right now, but he used to be a principal down in Los Angeles, like a superintendent. And so he knows, and this is back in the 70s and 80s. And so he knows the history, talks about it on a radio show that he has. So he knows the history of what happened in the schools in California. And he knows the even date and the procedure. And I don't remember what it is, but there's a certain procedure, the certain rule or certain municipal code that was passed that removed the teaching about the Constitution in California. I don't know what it was, but there was something, because from the time that the generation before me, I think it was, or maybe the generation before that, they learned about the Constitution, they learned about the law, and then my generation, we didn't. And so by the time I went into public school, I had never even heard of the Constitution. I mean, at least if we did, I don't remember. I don't remember. It wasn't anything more than just a mention. If it was, I don't remember anything about it. And so the Constitution was never taught in my household. It was never taught in school. And it turned out to be the most important, other than the scriptures itself, turned out to be the most important document that we have. And And if you look at the very first 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments are the ones that are the ones that actually govern pretty much our public servants. And the Constitution is about protecting the rights of the people against the overreaching government. You look at the purpose of why Madison had to write it. Madison was this genius, brilliant kid, and he was given the task to write the Constitution on behalf of Jefferson. Jefferson goes away to France. He's an ambassador at the time, and he was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. We just celebrated this. We're celebrating here coming up with 250 years of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And so you figure Jefferson is like the all-time hero that we have. Like he's our top founding father. Everyone says that maybe it's Benjamin Franklin or George Washington. I mean, I would say not even close. Nobody even comes close to Thomas Jefferson because he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I mean, he penned that himself, the parchment. And then, so he was the one that tasked Madison to write the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And then it went into the committees and it went into argument and it passed. But those first 10 amendments were about protecting the rights of the states and the people from the overreaching government. And so if you look at the Article 1 itself, and Article 1 is really so key. I mean, Amendment 1, Article 1 talks about the right to contract. And when I was over in China here recently and, doing things, this question kept coming up and people forget that you have a constitutional right to contract with one another. And when you and I make a contract, that's our private contract and that's nobody else's business. Nobody can interfere with that and infringe on our right. Now, if you're a disabled person or handicapped person or something and I'm taking advantage of you or, there's exceptions, of course, but a regular sound-minded person and another sound-minded person as consumers, just regular people, we're entering into a contract. That's our contract. Nobody can tell us that we can't make that contract. The government cannot infringe on it. That's what the Constitution says. Has no right to infringe on that contract. And that law is actually so strong that a case called Garfinkle versus Superior Court in 1979 actually went forward and said that, and they did this to protect the banks, of course, but now we can use it. They said that even the deed of trust is not an unconscionable contract because when you go in and sign a mortgage, I learned this the hard way. When you go in and sign the mortgage, you're signing this death pledge. You're basically signing this unconscionable contract where you're giving all your rights away to the bank without any collateral, and they're giving up nothing. And you look at it, you're like, why would I do that? If you really read the deed of trust, you're like, this is the stupidest contract I've ever, why would I sign this? First of all, it's unilateral. You got one person signing it, and they're giving up all their rights. They're pledging away all their rights. You're pledging away all your rights to the bank, and then now the bank has every right to collect and do anything they want to you. Basically do what's called in California, they call it a non-judicial foreclosure sale, where they could just take your house away from you and give you no court date. And basically not even doing it. You'll get a notice, you'll get a couple pieces of paper, but that's it. And then all of a sudden you're out. It's the most crazy contract. And but the court ruled in Garfinkle versus Superior Court, that contract is a good contract because they don't have the right to get in the way of it. And I think that they made an error on that case, but they did what they still did. That's how the law works. They said, well, people signed the Garfinkle, you signed this bad contract with the bank. And yeah, the bank didn't sign it, but it didn't matter because, it was a contract and we can't interfere with that contract because of the Constitution. And so they used the Constitution as the basis for why they couldn't interfere with the deed of trust, unconscionable death pledge contract. And funny thing about deed of trust is it's actually, if you read carefully, what happens is when you walk in and sign a deed of trust contract, you're signing the note, which is a separate document, and then you sign the deed of trust afterwards. The note pays for the property, and then the deed of trust actually puts you back into bondage to then give the bank or the trustee there all the rights to take it back from you after you've already paid for it. Imagine how stupid that is when you really read the paperwork. I mean, after I signed mine, I didn't read it. I signed it, gave it to him, went back, and I never read it until years later. I thought, wow, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Why would I do this? Why would I sign this thing? I mean, I couldn't believe it. So it's but yeah, that's just where you are. So now, I mean, after a lot of years of looking at it, it's like, look, the note pays for it. Sign the note, give it to him, take the deed of trust, walk out with it. Why would you give the deed of trust after the note? No, it makes no sense. Just walk out with a deed of trust and give them the note, and then the title's over. You don't need there's no reason to be bound back into the contract because the note pays for it. That's what it says. You're done. You're out. So the oh yeah, Catherine, you're on. I want to go over to you in a minute, but before I do, let's see. Okay, a couple of other things I wanted to go into. The last week, remember we had. Well, I'll cover that. I'll cover that a little bit later on with what's going on with Todd. So let's see. 508s. He talked about 508s, PMAs. He talked about the revocation of election. Talked about the status. And I had a call this week about status, and there was something that was interesting because when you look at the, I talked about the Supreme Court case. It's a Wong Kim Ark, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, where they've got the guy was over there in San Francisco, and he filed a writ of habeas corpus to get out of custody. And then they ended up giving him getting it to the Supreme Court, and they made this declaration over the case that all people born on U.S. soil are U.S. citizens, and that we're going to bring forward this old English common law over America for the first time, which is the feudal system. And that's a monumental case. It might get overturned this year, but we might actually change that law. It's very possible. I don't know, but we'll see. But the bottom line is that case is the one that changed everybody's status in U.S. citizens. Now, from basically like just a state common law state citizen to now a full-on feudal system, a feudal serf. But it also shows you, because of the Constitution, that you're not bound. We're not bound. We're not forced to being in that. We have the ability to say, well, that's fine what you did, but I don't consent to that. I revoke my consent. If I did imply that I was going to be okay with that system, I'm going to take that back right now. I'm going to do revocation of election because of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says you can't be bonded in slavery without your consent. You can be a slave or serf, but you can't do it involuntarily. That's the 13th Amendment. And so the point is that when with the status, it doesn't really do it doesn't give any benefit. That's the funny thing is the revocation of election. Once I went to the IRS and I went and did my revocation of election, it had nothing to do with my status. I mean, when I went into the Superior Court down there in Santa Clara and I did a status and I showed the judge I wasn't a U.S. citizen, and she's like, well, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you can't vote. And I said, well, that's all I wanted you to say, Judge. Thank you very much. And I got the writ. issued on this. And the clerk comes in and he says this. He makes a big deal. A clerk of the court, he comes in and says that I'm not a U.S. citizen, so I can't vote. And I said, well, that's exactly what I wanted you to say, pal. And so I won the case on what I wanted. Now they look like, but my point is there wasn't really any benefit. Like, what was in it for me? I didn't get anything out of that other than just, okay, peace of mind, I guess. Maybe, but it's a case-by-case basis, one by one. So the whole thing about revocation of election, it doesn't affect your status. Like status about U.S. citizen is separate from the tax code. The tax code is all about just the words inside the Title 26. Have nothing to do with the actual status. So I think there's a lot of confusion on that people are under. A lot of patriots are under regarding the status correction and what they get out of it. I guess the word is what they get out of it. I'm not saying you can't do it, but what do you actually get out of it is the thing. Because when I got the passport card, I thought, oh, this is great. Another amazing story. When I went down and did the passport card, and I did it 4 times, I think it was, before I finally, So there's a foreign affairs manual that talks about national inside when you go and do the passport. And this sent me down a rabbit hole that I was like, man, it was a kind of a loose end that I had to tie up. And inside of there, it talks about U.S. national and U.S. citizen. And I thought, because the foreign affairs manual said that a U.S. national, you could be a U.S. national. That's what I thought, if you went in there and made this declaration. But it turns out U.S. national is defined differently than a national. And they don't define what's called a national under Title 8, 101, 8 U.S.C. 1101. They don't define a national, one-word national, inside the Foreign Affairs Manual. So when I went in there and I said, this is not defined in here. And they said, well, And I remember met with this guy, Dimitri. He was in charge of the passport office, and we discussed this whole thing. And at first he told me, he's like, no problem. I'll put national on your passport card because that's what I paid for. I said, okay, great. I got my passport card. It said U.S. citizen on there. I said, well, I'm sorry. It said USA, not U.S. national, USA. So I went back in there and wanted my money back. And he goes, well, I'm really sorry about that, sir. We actually can't put national on there. It's not here. And I read the manual and I said, I see that. It's not even in here. So you can't be a national with a foreign and going outside the U.S. National is only for state citizens. So my determination on it was when I have a U.S. passport, I'm actually a U.S. citizen because I'm traveling internationally. But inside the domestic U.S. is that's where the state citizen rights come back in because it's Californian.